Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video I'll be talking about the Yakuza series once again, this time talking about my thoughts on the Western released spin-offs in the series. Now obviously there are some spin-offs that were only released in Japan, and considering that they don't have English releases, I won't be talking about them here. But in this video, I'll be talking about the 4 released in English, those being Yakuza Dead Souls, Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise, and the 2 Judgment games. And I will be talking about them in that order. Now this video will be more so focused on the Judgment games with full-blown rundowns of those games, while the other 2 games will more so just be talking about my more general thoughts on them. And with that, let's just jump right into it, starting with Yakuza Dead Souls, which was a PS3 exclusive non-canon Yakuza zombie game, because obviously everyone was clearly asking for that. And I'll be honest, this is the only game that we'll be talking about here that I have not finished for myself. Mainly because I just found the game kind of boring to the point where I just watched the playthrough online afterwards. And really, to me, this is just kind of a dull game, gameplay-wise, where the combat just got really repetitive, and with it not having a story that I really cared about, especially considering it's non-canon, I just didn't feel like continuing with it. Now, I'm not saying that this game has no merit to it. I mean, for fans of the more over-the-top and wacky elements of the Yakuza series, this game is definitely something that's going to give you something to chew on, with this game just being ridiculous the entire way, and most of the game feeling like a parody of the Yakuza franchise. Also, this game has you playing as 4 of the most popular characters in the series, with this being the first time you actually get to play as Majima or Ryuji Goda in a game, so I mean that's cool. The narrative does involve a lot of characters from the original games as well, but again, to me, the gameplay wasn't really able to hold my interest, with it feeling like a toned down version of Yakuza 4, which was the game that this spawned off from, and having a pretty dull combat system that focused so much on gunplay that I just found pretty uninteresting. Though again, it did feel ridiculous to just run through the streets of Kamurocho with guns in your hand shooting down zombies, but again, it's really just not for me. It's not the type of game that I was personally looking for, but I can get that there is an audience out there for this game. It's just not me. Now let's talk about the more recent spin-offs, starting with Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise, a Fist of the North Star game developed by RGG Studios for the PS4, which for all intents and purposes is a reskinned Yakuza game. And despite this being made after the release of Yakuza 6, they did end up deciding to use the Yakuza 0 engine when making this game, due to it being made by a mostly new staff, and this very much feels like a game that would have been released on the PS3. But despite that, and also the fact that I was relatively unfamiliar with the source material coming into this, I did still enjoy my experience playing this game. I mean, the base gameplay is again very similar to that of Yakuza 0 with some slight modifications. I personally did enjoy the change up in the combat system, which had a bit more of a fast pace with the addition of hidden channeling points, which is essentially the ability to stun your opponents, and if you time the QuickTime event correctly, it does lead to an instant kill on most enemies. And that did make fighting against these massive groups of enemies a lot more tolerable here, and did make the combat feel a bit fresh from the typical Yakuza fighting system, which I really felt like was repetitive by this point. And even the finishers in this game felt a lot more in line with the rest of the series, where I did feel like some of them come off as pretty ridiculous in the Yakuza games considering the relatively grounded nature of its core narrative, but with this game inherently having a more fantastical element to its story, the over-the-top finishers really do work here. And the same thing goes for the other more ridiculous elements of the game as well, like Kenshiro managing a nightclub and pretending like he's a doctor. The sub-stories fit the overall tone of the game a bit better here, and that is something I've always felt was jarring with the main Yakuza games, that I know some people do like about the games, but it's something that I've always felt was weirdly managed in the main series. The open world of this game is the city of Eden, which contains most of the same styles of locations of your typical Yakuza city, and really the open world elements of this game play exactly the same. Though outside the city, there is the Wasteland, another larger open world that you can navigate with your buggy, which did feel like an interesting change to the formula from the Yakuza games, where this really made it feel a lot more like a Mad Max sort of game. Though I will say that I did get annoyed by the amount of random encounters within them, and also didn't like how you were forced to craft upgrades for your buggy throughout the main story. That did just feel kind of tedious. Now as for the narrative, I mean, it was mostly fine. I mean, it's kind of what you would expect from a Yakuza plot. It didn't really provide anything overly complex, though it does lead to a decent amount of ridiculous plot twists along the way. Kenshiro also ends up fitting right in here, being portrayed pretty similarly to that of Kiryu in the main story. And I did find the rest of the side characters here pretty likable, particularly Jagre, who ends up being Ken's doofusy sidekick despite him starting off as an antagonist. But really the narrative of this game was pretty baseline for me. Nothing particularly notable, but still did keep my interest for the majority of it. And to be honest, for probably more of it than the majority of the main Yakuza games. And really overall, again, Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise does feel like a Yakuza game through and through. Outside of it using the Fist of the North Star property, it doesn't really do much to distinguish itself from the other Yakuza games. Again, it just feels like a reskinned Yakuza game, but was one that I actually did enjoy much more than I was expecting. But now let's jump into the meat and bones of the video by talking about the Judgment series, with us obviously starting off with the first game, which ends up using the Dragon engine that was used for Yakuza 6, and this game does very much play like that in many ways, probably too much so, to where that does lead to one of my bigger criticisms of this game, is that I don't feel like this game does enough to differentiate itself from the main series from a gameplay perspective, where it very much just feels like a copy and paste of the previous games, which, I mean, to be fair, is a criticism of the entire series, but for a spin-off here to essentially be the exact same game, but with them changing out the characters and story, it did feel kind of underwhelming. Now, I do feel like those characters and the story was pretty strong, but the gameplay itself just felt kind of stale to me, with the additions that were made here being things that kind of annoyed me. Now, through this game, you do play as a private detective and former lawyer Takayuki Yagami, and through that, the main additions to this game do relate to being a detective. This game does have investigations where you search a scene for clues. I mostly found these sections annoying, as I would always miss one minor thing within it and end up wasting a lot of time before being able to finish it. There are also points where you have to present the correct evidence to progress the story, and that played into detective elements as well, but again, I just found that to be kind of tedious, and leads to you getting these really awkward cutscenes of Yagami just stumbling his way through the incorrect answer. This game added tailing missions, because everyone loves tailing missions. There's also a lock-picking system, and disguises that you use at points, but again, none of these changes end up booting the experience too much for me, and really feel like the bare minimum for them to be doing here to differentiate the game from the main series. The combat in Judgment, though, is mostly strong here, where it is pretty similar to the combat system of Yakuza 0, where you can change between styles mid-combat, though I did like how Yagami also implements parkour into his movements, but something I did find pretty annoying with the combat is how easy it was for Yagami to get major runes that end up lowering your maximum health and you having to constantly go to a doctor to restore it, which definitely added a level of tedium there, which is something that I do end up fixing for the next game. But really, at the end of the day, most of the game functions here end up playing pretty similarly to previous Yakuza games. But with that, let's start talking about the narrative, which to me is the strong suit of this game. And the star Yagami, who I did find to be a mostly likable character here, with him getting a really strong narrative to introduce him to the game here, with this case that we end up solving through this game being one that ends up being pretty personal to his character, really setting up his redemption arc in a similar way to how previous protagonists in the series have had their starts, where we do learn that he worked for Genda Law Office, where he had a successful defense of Shinpei Okubo in a murder trial, only for Okubo to end up supposedly killing his girlfriend a month later, which ends up shaming him to where he ends up quitting being a lawyer. I did like this backstory for him, to which he ends up redeeming himself by the end of the story, by end up solving the crime through it. But then we do jump forward 3 years to where Yagami has now become a detective and works alongside Kaito, who is a great best friend figure for him here, really playing off of Yagami pretty well, and also feels pretty similar to characters that we would typically meet in the previous games in the Yakuza series. But here we do work alongside him to investigate a serial killer that has been killing Yakuza and gouging their eyes out, which we do to end up helping out his friends at the Genda Law Office, who have been hired to defend Kyohei Himura, the main suspect in this case. And this investigation in the eventual trial does end up taking up the majority of Chapter 1, which ends up being probably the longest chapter in the game, obviously having a bevy of tutorial sections and introducing us to the main group of characters. But through my replay, I did find this to be one of the more tedious sections in the game, and really just in general, I did find there to be a lot more tedious tasks throughout the main story that ended up annoying me a lot more through the replay, with there being many points where it would just tell me to do something. I would have no clue why I'm actually doing this within the story. And really, I just feel like this game does have a good chunk of filler within it. But during this section, there is a cool stakeout mission that introduces you to the sky system. And also we have the first use of the drone. And really, stakeout's always been a section that's like stuck out to me, despite it not being the most fun gameplay experience. But here we do find out that Hamura can't be the killer, though we do suspect that he knows who the real killer is, who we have now labeled as the Mole. Chapter 2 involves our first interaction with Jester, the leader of a mass gang of burglars, that ends up being a major character moving forward, who ends up saving us after being attacked by Hamura after trying to further investigate into him. Chapter 3 involves us dealing with Higashi, one of Hamura's lackeys, and through this chapter we do end up gaining him as an ally, doing so in a way that made it feel similar to that of what you would expect from a shonen anime. And that progresses in chapter 4, where Jester reveals himself to be Sugiura, who also ends up joining our investigation, ends up being a major ally moving forward. But this chapter does end in a pretty great way, with Yagami learning that he is now being targeted by the Mole, ends up finding the body of Shintani, a colleague of his from Genda Law Office, dead in his office with his eyes gouged out, which really ups the stakes of the narrative moving forward. And in chapter 5, we do encounter Mitsuru Kuroiwa, the lead detective in charge of the Mole murders, who is obviously a very important character later on, but he always felt like a very sketchy figure to me, and it didn't really surprise me when we eventually get the major revelation later on. But through the death of Shintani, we do end up gaining the support of the Genda Law Office, which essentially adds Sayori and Hoshino, the two remaining attorneys there, as a part of our, again, growing group of allies. And we do end up investigating the ADDC, a medical research center, along with Hoshino, as it was the last location that Shintani called before his death. And conveniently, also the location where the Okubo murder that Yagami defended took place. And through this, we do get some great flashbacks to Yagami 3 years ago, where we find out what happened during the Okubo case, where we do find out that the testimony of Okubo's girlfriend, Emi Terasawa, ended up being the deciding factor in that case, making it even more tragic when he ends up getting arrested later for her murder. But through the interactions with the center's director, Kido, and the head researcher, Shono, it does become clear that they had something to do with Shintani's death, leading us to chapter 6, where we do get a lot of interactions with Mafuyu Fiji, Yagami's ex-girlfriend and former fellow lawyer, that was voiced by the same voice actress that played Makoto in Persona 5, and I couldn't get that out of my head whenever listening to her voice. We do find out that Kuroiwa considers Yagami the #1 suspect in the murder, which again to me made it very clear that he was going to end up as an antagonist. But afterwards, Mafuyu ends up getting attacked and we do end up saving her, but it really leads to us interacting with the chairman of the Kajihira group, who in chapter 7 ends up tasking us with a new investigation into the murder of the former vice director of ADDC, who was a saboteur for Kajihira. And through this, we do get this really notable scene where we need to infiltrate a hostess club, and to do that, we do end up giving Sayori a makeover to have her go in undercover, and that's fun and matches the more ridiculous elements of the series, though realistically it doesn't add much to the core narrative. Chapter 8 starts with Kuroiwa arresting Ayabe, one of our detective allies, for the Shintani murder, which does add to the stakes of us having to prove his innocence, and we end up having to defend him in court. But with the stakes raised and no real leads, we do once again have to track down Hamura as the only person that we know knows the mole's identity. Him, though, he does refuse to reveal the mole's identity because they need to make the game longer. Inconveniently, Hamura is able to escape here, leading to us having to track him down again later on in the story. Through this, we do find out that Shono, the ADCC researcher, is the real mastermind here behind the mole, who hired the mole to kill his human test subjects in order to cover his experiments, and that the murders that Okubo was framed for are part of this conspiracy, which is a solid reveal that merges the two main investigations of the story. Chapter 9 does involve Yagami and Sugiura once again going to the ADDC to confront Shono, which confirms this theory, leading to us having to expose his crimes. And we do get some great scenes between Yagami and Okubo, of Yagami promising to prove his innocence. Chapter 10 revolves around having to find Hamura again, because why not? But this does lead to a confrontation with him where he does end up shooting and kidnapping Kaito, leading to us and Sugiura having to track him down, where we do eventually have our final fight with him. Chapter 11 starts with this ridiculously long interrogation in the cabaret, where we get a pretty long exposition dump of Homura explaining his role in the conspiracy, but eventually Homura's gang ends up setting the cabaret on fire, leading to this fun set piece of having to escape the burning building. But as we leave, we are stopped by the mole, who tries to kill Homura, but Matsugane ends up taking the bullet for him, which is a sad farewell for Matsugane, who I haven't really even mentioned in this video up until this point, despite him actually playing a pretty big role in the story, but who cares? But through his death, we do get Homura finally being able to reveal the mole's identity, who is mind-blowingly Kuroiwa, because, again, who knew? But we do end up getting taken to the police headquarters, where we are questioned by Kuroiwa, which leads to a fun standoff between the two, where Kuroiwa admits to being the mole and that he will kill Yagami's entire team, again really upping the stakes once again, leading us to chapter 12, where we now have to track down Kaito, as he is the most likely to talk to reveal the details of the conspiracy, leading to another undercover Sayori section, where she has to get Kaito to grope her in order to blackmail him, and this just felt weird, but it does lead to us interrogating him, and this is where we get more exposition, which really just confirms what we already knew about Shono. But here we do learn about Shono's secret lab that leads to an annoying tailing mission that goes on for way too long in order to find the location, though once we do get there, it is a cool set piece of fighting through this really dark, creepy lab that ends with a boss battle against the Hangman, which just felt weird for a mostly grounded game to have this fight against a mutated guy, but whatever. Here we do end up finding Shono, where Sugiura ends up pulling the knife on him, and here we do get the reveal that Sugiura is actually the younger brother of Emi Terasawa, and had actually joined Yagami initially to sabotage him until he learned the truth about Emi's murder and is now actually on our side, which is a cool reveal. I really like how this recontextualizes his early appearances in the story and gives him a further connection to the core narrative of the game. But eventually the police arrive and end up covering everything up, leading to us getting Mafiu to agree to help us expose the conspiracy in the middle of a Yabe's murder trial, leading us to the final chapter, which has a good amount of filler leading into the trial, but once we do get there, it doesn't let up from that point forward. I do love that this trial is Yagami's first time back in court since the Okubo trial, feeling like a full circle moment for him, where we do get the reveal that Homura has agreed to help reveal the conspiracy and ends up testifying alongside Kaito, fully exposing Shono's experiments. With the conspiracy exposed, Kuroiwa is now on the run, where he plans on killing Shono after Shono had attempted to kill him in order to cover the conspiracy up, leading us to the final boss battle, where we do confront Kuroiwa at the ADDC, and I will say that this final fight here did feel a bit anticlimactic, with it just functioning like any random fight, just with him having slightly more health than normal. It really didn't feel like that massive of a spectacle that Yakuza typically makes its final fights. But after his defeat, Kuroiwa still attempts to kill Shono, only for him to be shot down here, and for Shono to then reveal that he has perfected the drug that caused this entire conspiracy and uses it on himself, only for it to still be defective, causing him to succumb from it. And this is where we do get the reveal that the reason that the victim's eyes were gouged out was because the drug turns the people's eyes blue, which was a cool reveal. I mean, overall it doesn't really add much, but it was a nice explanation here for why that was the killer's mode of operation. And overall, I did like how they end up killing the two major antagonists here without having Yagami directly have to do so, which would have felt out of character for him. And through that, I think it gave these two characters satisfying conclusions to their arcs as villains in the story. But this does lead to the epilogue, which plays out as you would expect it to. I mean, Okubo is set to be released from prison, and we do get to see Sugiura apologize to him for thinking that he killed Emi. The ADDC gets shut down, and we have Yagami decide not to return to the law and instead continue working as a private detective alongside Kaito. Again, pretty much what you would expect from the ending of this game. And again, I do really love the narrative of the First Judgment here. I mean, introducing us to a great set of characters and giving us this personal story for Yagami here, with him being able to redeem himself for his perceived wrongdoings. Again, I do have issues with how much filler there is in the game. That does end up bloating the main narrative, but really, that's my issue with most Yakuza games. But with that being said, it is the gameplay and the mission structure that doesn't really hold up as well for me on the replay, but I still do have a level of reverence for this game, considering it is a game that originally got me into the series. But with that, let's talk about the final game for this video, the sequel to Judgment, Lost Judgment, which is actually a really solid sequel to the original game, improving upon the gameplay of it in pretty much every conceivable way. Though I will say that narratively, while it is strong, it definitely doesn't live up to the original, with this feeling more episodic, with the cases that the story revolves around not having much actual connection to the character of Yagami. Though his character does get a lot to chew on here, with him having some strong moments throughout. But before getting into that, let's talk about the gameplay changes made for this game. First, this game clearly is built off the additions made to the Dragon engine for Like a Dragon, with you being able to explore both Kamurocho and Injincho, the main setting of Like a Dragon. In addition, that I found fun was the skateboard, which does feel ridiculous to be playing as a lawyer turned detective riding around town on a skateboard, but it did shake up the navigation in the open world. I did find it fun to be doing these tricks around the city. But again, it did feel weird to playing as Yagami riding on a skateboard. Another ridiculous element of this game is the addition of the detective dog that you can walk around town with to find items and track down suspects. And again, this was just really weird. I didn't really spend that much time with it. Side content mostly functions the same with your standard side cases, though there are the addition of school stories, which are side missions based around the high school, which again was weird to see Yagami helping out students with their random issues like coaching in a dance team, which is something that a detective who is trying to solve a murder should definitely stop his investigation to do. But I mean, again, really, it's more of the ridiculous things that do play into this fun dichotomy that a lot of people love from the Yakuza series. Also, I do like that this game fully embraces the detective elements of the series in its gameplay more so than the first game, where again, to me, the mechanics in the first game felt mostly tacked on there, but here they do improve upon these sections and they do feel more prominent in the story. I do still get annoyed from the first person investigation sections, but they did make tailing missions a bit better with the addition of blending in plain sight. They did also add full-blown stealth sections that can be annoying at points, but you can crouch behind cover, use items or coins as distractions, and do stealth takedowns. They also do have some parkour sections where you have to find a path to a location and climb up pipes or do laches or wall runs to get there, and that was interesting, though, I mean, I'll be honest, I did get kind of annoyed with some of the climbing sections, as they do control pretty clunkily, with there being many points where you would think that you would be able to climb on something, but for some reason the game just doesn't let you do so. But finally, let's talk about the combat system, which is possibly my favorite in the entire series. I mean, it really does continue off of this like Yakuza 0 inspired combat, but this time adds in a new style, being the snake style, which I really enjoyed using and actually did end up using it for most of my time playing the game, where it does focus a lot more on quick attacks that really flowed well together, you being able to easily counter enemy attacks. I overall really like the pace of the combat here, with fights rarely overstaying their welcome, and again, I think this is probably my favorite combat system in the series. But with that, now let's talk about the narrative, which does take place 3 years after events of the first game, and not much has seemed to change in that time. We do start the game with a pretty lengthy prologue with Yagami and Kaito doing a more standard job of following around this girl's boyfriend, during which we get introduced to the game's mechanics like tailing, parkour, stealth, and chase sections, but really this entire case is without much consequence to the main story. Afterwards, we do return to Genda Law Office and learn of a case that Sayori and Hoshino are working on that involves a groping done by a policeman named Ihara, which ends up being related to the main case within the game, which is humorous that it starts off with something as minor as a groping incident, but ends up exploding into this massive conspiracy. But eventually Yagami gets a call from Sugiura, who reveals that he has started his own detective agency in Injincho, with Tsukumo, a really minor character from the first game that I didn't even bother mentioning there, as he really is just this generic tech-savvy ally that doesn't really play that much of a role in that game, but obviously plays a bigger role here. But they end up asking for Yagami and Kaito's help, leading us to the real start of Chapter 1. We do end up learning that the case that they have taken on involves bullying at Seiryo High, and we end up meeting the school's chairman, who is bizarrely voiced by Jameson Price, who also voices the bartender in Tender and also Sojiro in Persona 5, and really his voice is so recognizable to me that it really took me out of whatever scene he was in. But we do get tasked with secretly setting up cameras around the school while disguised as a repairman. And through this section, we do end up meeting a teacher, Yoko Sawa, who does have a cold intro to us, feeling like a foil for Yagami early on here with her not trusting us, but she does end up playing a major role moving forward. But through this, we do end up stopping a bullying incident through planting some speakers in the room, and through backing the girl up, the other students end up speaking up against the bullies as well, really playing into the themes of the story here, with Yagami talking about the bystander effect, allowing him to inspire people to speak up for what's right. Also along the way, while checking up on the cameras, Yagami ends up getting suspected of being a pervert, leading to a dumb section of him escaping through climbing on the outside of the school and him needing to beat up a whole bunch of students. And this really felt ridiculous and really felt out of line for Yagami's character here. But chapter 1 does end up ending with Yagami getting a call from Sayori, who needs help back in Kamurocho, after Ihara ends up revealing at his sentencing that he knew about the death of a student teacher from Seiru, Mikoshiba, before the police actually did, adding into this mystery of how he is involved, but also kickstarting the narrative with us now having to investigate into his death, which is a much more interesting case than just high school bullying. But this ends up leading to chapter 2, where we do start the investigation at Seiru High, where we do learn that Mikoshiba played a role in Ihara's son's suicide, but eventually we do learn that Sawa knows more than she is letting on, with her having a connection to Ihara's son and having a disdain for Mikoshiba. Leading us to chapter 3, where we do actually end up talking to her, only first to tell her to meet her in a cafe later in the day because they need to make the game longer. After even more filler, we do go to meet up with Sawa, but right outside the cafe, we are attacked by some masked men, during which we are introduced to Kuwana, probably the best and one of the more complex new characters for this game, who does get a really bizarre introduction here, with him just showing up out of nowhere and offering to help us in this fight without much context to it, though I did like how he kind of serves as a mirror and a rival figure to Yagami here, with us getting a pretty minor boss battle with him right away. Though realistically, I did find it dumb to have them literally in a fist fight right in front of the cafe here for no real reason, but eventually we are able to talk to Sawa, who conveniently was visited by a mysterious person right beforehand that causes Sawa to tell Yagami to stay away from the case. And this type of event happens continuously in the game here, where we end up going to someone to get information only for them to end up either not giving us anything or for them just to say things that we already knew, which does lead to some annoyances of how this story is being told. Next up, we do have chapter 4, which has us investigating Mikoshiba's murder scene, where we do encounter Watanabe, a police officer that I was expecting to play a major role in the story, considering how he's introduced here, but he really just doesn't do much, despite him and Yagami agreeing to work together. We also, along the way, do an investigation of the subway station where the groping incident happened, which through this, you deduce that the groping incident must have been staged, with Ihara using the groping incident as an alibi for the murder, which is kind of an insane plot point here, but one that is pretty fun, as it ends up being something that I didn't even think was a possibility here. Now, the chapter does also include our first interaction with Ihara, who does come off as pretty sadistic, clearly taunting the lawyers, and talks about wanting to make a mockery of the legal system, which has failed him. But this does lead to chapter 5, where we interact with Mafuyu, who seemed to just be there because she was in the original game. I mean, she really doesn't have much to do here. We do also get continuously attacked by the RK gang and end up infiltrating their hideout in this chapter to tell their leader to stop, which was really weird. But this does lead to a pretty lengthy stealth section, but eventually we do get introduced to Soma, RK's leader, who does end up becoming one of the main antagonists of the game, who is a pretty strong, intimidating villain, but also one that does feel kind of generic at points, feeling like many of the other villains we've seen from the Yakuza series already. But he does have a strong intro here, with this scene really showcasing his really cold demeanor. Chapter 6 revolves around us getting to play as Sayori, just like in the first game, where she does go undercover to learn more about RK, and outside of reintroducing Higashi to the story, this doesn't end up playing that much of a factor to the main narrative. Chapter 7 has Yagami going to Sawa's apartment to question her, only for Kuwana to surprisingly also be there, and for us to be ambushed by RK, where Kuwana is able to escape, but Yagami is confronted by Soma once again, where we do learn Kuwana's real name is Kitakata, being the actual person that they are tracking down, which really adds into the mystery of how Kuwana is involved in all this. But the chapter does end with the reveal that Sawa has been murdered, giving Yagami a personal stake in the story moving forward. But one that didn't really feel that earned to me, as I never really felt the connection between Yagami and Sawa as being one that was ever that strong. Though it's one that he constantly compares to the murder of Emi Terasawa, which obviously does play into his background. But chapter 8 does start with us investigating the crime scene, which felt very reminiscent of what happened with the Shintani murder in the first game. We do also end up trying to hunt Kuwana down, only to once again be ambushed by Soma, which kind of ends up being a trend in this game. But through this, Kaito ends up being injured and is out of commission until the end game. Chapter 7 does give us more background on Kuwana, with the reveal that he is the former teacher of a student named Mitsuru, who was also bullied and ended up attempting suicide, which has caused Kuwana to now strive to get justice for these type of situations, which ends up really connecting him to the main themes of the narrative. Afterwards, we do confront Mamiya, who ends up confirming her role in the conspiracy, and we end up doing a pretty lengthy interrogation as the standard in every Yakuza game. But here we do learn that Kuwana has blackmailed her into helping with the murder of Mitsuru's bully and numerous other bullies over the last 5 years in his suit for redemption. Chapter 10 has us now with the knowledge of how Kuwana operates. Find out that must mean that Mitsuru's mother, Reiko Tsukamoto, must also have been involved in her son's bully's murder, and with her being a high-ranking political figure, we do deduce that she is involved in RK hunting Kuwana down as a way for her to tie up loose ends. This really ends up upping the urgency of having to find him. So after learning his supposed location, we do have a cool set piece that involves trying to surpass the police in RK to try to get to him, only for Kuwana to not be there because the game needs to keep on going. But we eventually do find him, during which we do get some great character moments for Kuwana, with his interaction with Yagami really being a highlight of the narrative here, with them both striving for the same thing in getting justice for those that aren't able to get it through the law, but the approach to these situations is very different, with Kuwana's path leading to more collateral damage along the way. In chapter 11, we do get another Sayori undercover section where we do try to lure RK out, and this leads to a humorous scene where Genda and Hoshino end up visiting her, though it is one that does feel very out of place in the narrative here. But the main development from this section is that we do learn that Soma is actually an undercover agent for public security, with the rest of RK not actually knowing of this connection, making this the reason why RK is hunting Kuwana down. Afterwards, chapter 12 doesn't actually progress the narrative too much, so let's just jump right into the final chapter, where the first half of it does revolve around the Hara case, which does feel like a pretty similar structure to how the final chapter of the first game was done, where Yagami has to act as the defense attorney for the retrial here, where we end up using the trial as a way to expose Kuwana and Ihara, but also as a way to lure Soma out as well. And the plan does end up going off without a hitch, with Ihara taking the stand for himself, initially just mocking the process until we do end up making him break to the point where he just admits to the crime. But afterwards, we do get a call from Kuwana, who reveals that he is with Mitsuru's bully's body, which is being frozen in a warehouse in Jincho, leading to our final gameplay section of having to find our way through the warehouse to get to Kuwana, which along the way we have a bevy of fights with RK members, eventually find Soma and Kuwana near the body, and have our final face-off with Soma inside of a cold storage unit, which felt like a pretty baseline fight, which again, kind of underwhelming coming from Soma, who I did feel like was a pretty intimidating villain. But the final fight here kind of just plays out as your standard boss battle. But after Soma's defeat, Yagami and Kuwana once again have a debate on how to resolve this conflict, with Yagami wanting to get justice for Sawa, while Kuwana wants to keep Kutsumoto out of jail, leading to the final boss battle with Kuwana, which again, I was expecting a bit more gravitas here, though again, it's a fine final boss battle, and one that does fit the themes of the narrative here. Afterwards, the plot does conclude as you would expect it to, with Kutsumoto arriving and deciding to turn herself in. We have Kuwana finally admitting to the collateral damage that he has caused, And this is a really strong scene for him with the amount of emotion that Kuwana ends up portraying here, which ends up acting as a pretty satisfying conclusion to his story arc. And this does also lead to another great moment for Yagami's character as well, where Kuwana talks about how flawed the law is, and Yagami agrees and says that he'll be there to save those that the law can't. Which that one line felt like a great representation of Yagami's role in the story. Now I will say that I did find the final scene of the game to be kind of heavy-handed, where we do see another bullying incident take place, but this time it is stopped by those that Yagami has inspired throughout the game, which, to be fair, really does exude Yagami's flat character arc here of showing his already developed character now having influence over those that he's interact with, though I did find it hilarious how ridiculously blatant it was being here. But either way, I mean, I did really enjoy the conclusion to the story here, with it providing a lot of great character moments for both Yagami and Kuwana, and really I do like this game as a whole, where I do think gameplay wise is probably the best in the series, improving upon pretty much everything from the original Judgment outside of narrative. But again, I do find that main narrative to be pretty bloated here, where it really just moves at a snail's pace at points, with there being many points where the game acts as if a scene is really important to the main story, but it ends up revealing just information that we already knew. But despite that, it is still a very strong entry in the series, and while I do think the base narrative of the first game is stronger, I do think this is a better game in almost every other way. But there we go. I mean, those are essentially my thoughts on the Yakuza spin-offs, and with that, that also includes my series of videos on the Yakuza series. I've now talked about every North American release up until this point. Now, if we do ever get another Judgment game down the road, or whenever we do get an entry in the main series down the road, I definitely do plan on doing videos about those when I get around to playing them, but that's obviously for the future. So for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.